This video will follow the format of spending the majority of the slides comparing different contexts where the personality differences may play a role, and then spending the last 3 slides on potential areas of conflict or agreement and some tips to help you work together better. The first area of difference is interests. So INTJs and ENTPs will generally be interested in different parts of a project. The INTJ will be interested in the process of finishing a project, whereas the ENTP would be interested more in initiating a project. So INTJs are driven by selecting for goals that they can achieve and actually achieving them. There's a sense of mastery and power that comes from being able to execute and finish things. Whereas for the ENTP, finishing things is not as important as starting things. Even if they may want to finish projects, they generally are not driven to it. So it may be a priority, but it's not as high of a priority as the INTJ. As a result, the first difference you'll observe here is that the INTJ will be very selective about which goals they undertake. So if they think that a project is interesting, but it will not succeed for whatever reasons, they may pre-select against it. Whereas the ENTP selects for originality, so they're a lot more open to the idea that the constraints that are around are not reliable, so the constraints may change. So for example, if they have a brilliant idea, but they can't execute on it now, they won't immediately abandon the idea. The circumstances that prevent this idea from being executed might change in the future. So they're more open-minded towards the future. And as a result, they select for originality. And this can be an area of conflict because the INTJ might shut down the ideas that the ENTP proposes or narrow them down. And then the ENTP may find the INTJ's approach perhaps too conventional, too safe, or not that original. Another difference, and this is related to the first one, this explains the motivational patterns that underlie the first difference, is that INTJs are sensitive to fulfilling commitments they've made to themselves. So if an INTJ sets a goal and they don't finish it, even if they've lost interest in that goal halfway through the process, they may still feel the need to honor that initial commitment. And this generally comes from being highly conscientious. The INTJs that are lower in conscientiousness may not necessarily feel this way, whereas the ENTP is open to continued innovation. So as long as there's a sense that if they're not adding anything original to the collective knowledge of humankind or their team or whatever group they're in, or even themselves, if there's nothing new happening, if there's nothing new being discovered, if a new relationship between ideas or a new perspective isn't found, then the work becomes dry and algorithmic and mechanical, and they can lose interest in that. An INTJ approaches a project by locking down a vision. So they would like to have a destination in mind before they start, but they're very flexible on how they get there. So they can be quite open to changing approaches, changing methodologies, if it gets them there faster. Whereas an ENTP generally doesn't care that much about a solid end goal. They're more interested in what would happen if they stick to a set of trusted approaches or procedures or philosophies or methodologies consistently. They're open to discover whatever end result may come about. So it's more of a generative approach. They're interested in processes that continually generate, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a final end goal. They're more open to changing goals, changing milestones, and changing requirements for whatever they're working on. And as a result, They're not as resistant to changes in direction. They're a little bit more flexible. If they're working on a business, they can pivot easier. They don't necessarily have to have this perfect or final vision that they're working towards. The INTJ gets a lot of pride from having the ability to deliver, from being a solid member of the team whose promises are usually fulfilled. And as a result, they can internalize the success of a project. So if they've done everything they can, and yet they're not able to fulfill that initial promise because of other external factors, they may feel bad. And as a result, they will pre-select against even people who may interfere with that, who may prevent them from finishing things. Whereas the ENTP is more interested in ingenuity and innovation. Instead of the actual execution of a task, they're more interested in being the discoverer of an idea or the inventor of some kind of solution. And they would like to be recognized for it. So instead of having a long list of completed projects, a patent or a paper is just as useful to them, even if it's purely theoretical. And then finally, INTJs generally have an imposing attitude towards the external world. So they would like to assert their will over the world. And the more the world conforms to, and the future conforms to their vision, the more powerful they feel. So they may not be interested in things that they can't control fully or they can't predict. If things are chaotic, if things are too open-ended, then they may just pre-select against them. The ENTP, on the other hand, is interested in starting as many projects as they can, and they have a sort of scattershot approach where one of these is going to work, and they'll likely incubate a lot of disparate projects, a lot of side hobbies, a lot of side projects, and they generally just want to see how the dynamic world is going to evolve and how it's going to interact with their project and see how it goes. So they're more optimistic towards new ideas than the INTJ is. The INTJ may be reluctant to help the ENTP on a project if they don't see the final destination. And many times the factors that prevent completion are not even in the idea itself, but a lot of the surrounding circumstances, like the people, budgetary constraints, stuff like that. So if they even feel like this teammate or the ENTP is not personally well suited to completing this project, they may not pick it up. So they're a lot slower to ramp up to a new idea. All right, the second slide is about ideation. So the way they generate ideas is very different. INTJs are constantly perceiving patterns semi-consciously and creating an internal schema of the world that explains everything with as much breadth as possible. And in addition to this, they will focus on a theme and double down on that and go very deep. So there's this idea that the INTJ is an expert in some domain, some process, some kind of skill, and they want to reach the bottom of that skill. They want to reach the maximum amount of understanding there. So they're drawn to depth. They're drawn to complete ideas. They're drawn to models that explain everything, strong predictive ideas. Whereas the ENTP is mistrustful of specializing too early, and as a result, they care for the quantity of ideas as much as the quality, and they may want to have as many ideas as possible. They don't want to dismiss ideas as impractical early on. So as a result, the ENTP will be more interested in exploring possibilities. They don't want to shut down possibilities too early. There's a sense of killing a baby before it grows, and all ideas have some potential. It's the external world that limits them. There's a certain kind of optimism and a certain almost childlike fascination with generating new ideas. The INTJ, on the other hand, has already started, and this is introverted, so a lot of people don't see it, but they already have an internal method of sorting priorities and ideas according to how it's important to either them or the world. So there's a strong backbone of values or convictions, and as a result, it carries with it a sense of urgency, a sense of importance. It's not something to play with. They have to limit their search time to pick an idea. There's also a sense in which the INTJs are possessed by specific visions. And this is another area of difference, is that the INTJ will have an insight or some kind of particular end goal in mind that they didn't arrive at through conscious means. They can get possessed by these visions of how things are going to go. And that may impel them to hyper-focus and cut out everything else. Generally, if the INTJs will develop, these visions will have already been pre-refined, pre-screened for feasibility and stuff like that, depending on their level of competence. The strength of this conviction, or the workings behind it, or the justification is not entirely obvious to the ENTP, because the ENTP is open to conscious methods of reducing, prioritizing, and evaluating ideas. That's why they're drawn to logic and philosophy. These are ways in which we can articulate different thought processes and meta-thought processes, and they like to debate these, and they like to prioritize these and select for some of these. And so the idea of somewhat democratically, openly selecting ideas and dismissing some of them is something they prefer to do, whereas the INTJ has already subjectively done that. And their drive can get tied to this vision. And once they're possessed by specific visions, they then want to reconcile the material reality with the vision. Whereas the ENTP is just as open to the idea that the material reality may not be what we think it is. The constraints that we think there are may not be there. Or it could be that they have this great idea, but it just may not be the right time. So the conflict between vision and reality is not that big of a source of friction for the ENTP. They are very open-ended to the idea that the constraints may disappear or someone else may solve the problems. It's the ideas that matter. So material realization of an idea is less important to the ENTP than it is to the INTJ. And then finally, there's this purposefulness of an idea. So to the INTJ, an idea has to have a point. If there's no point to it, and a point here, it may mean something that solves a predefined problem for the group or the world, or something that's personally useful for them as a way of progressing up a skill ladder or something. And it has to have some constraints, some kind of time box, and some sort of definition. Without that, the INTJ thinks a lot of ideation is just meaningless wandering. Whereas the ENTP never wants to be prevented from their open-ended, free, perpetual brainstorming. They think that there's always a better idea around the corner. And the idea of limiting oneself to one vision, to one way of approaching goals is cruel to all of those other potential ideas that have not made it. I conceptualize the ideas of NTPs as little babies that they create, and they don't want to just toss them aside because the immediate context isn't ready for them. So there's this disconnection between what's needed immediately and what's relevant immediately versus what is perhaps true in the judgment of the ENTP. All right, problem solving. The INTJ is relatively conservative with problem solving methods. They generally don't care about methods as much as the ENTP does. So to clarify what I mean by this, if you're working on some kind of research paper, the point of the research paper is to discover some findings or something like that. The methods used, the procedures used, the citation format used, all of these things are of lesser importance to the INTJ as actually getting there. The destination takes precedence. So even if there's a new and hot method to solve a problem that may be more efficient, if in the larger scheme of things, the larger view of things for the INTJ, if it doesn't make that much of a difference, then they may forego it. They're not purists when it comes to ideologies and philosophies on how to do things. So they can sometimes be flexible with using duct tape and bubblegum solutions if it works. They are also risk averse with experimentation because they generally have a phobia of the external world as naturally chaotic, and especially of people as unreliable. As a result, changing things unnecessarily just because it seems like a good idea isn't something that they're happy with, isn't something that they want to do. They're cautious about second order and tertiary effects of changing things. This can lead to some sort of intellectual stasis because if they can easily grow comfortable with ideas that they've internalized and understood deeply. So like a good example would be if an INTJ becomes really good at a programming language or some kind of programming ideology or methodology, they can become the best at it and then grow comfortable with it because it works. They're not going to go out of their way to learn some esoteric academic language, or they're not, even if they do it, they're not going to do it for work. They're going to do it on their own time. So there's a sense of, and this is a trait they share with ISTJs, is that they can be cautious. And then finally, the INTJ can get exhausted easily by the trial error feedback loop. So getting it right the first time is very important to them. Like they say, measure 3 times and then cut once, and that's one way the INTJ approaches problems. Whereas the ENTP is very much in love with the process. They, being perceivers, they live in the present moment, and the future is still unfolding, and as a result, they want to have a good time, and they want their work to be adventurous and fun, and they're okay with a little bit of chaos. They may want to even engineer some chaos, invent some chaos, just to challenge the system. They're okay with taking risks, and they take a genuine enjoyment from the trial and error feedback loop. And this may have to do with just being extroverts, as extroverts tend to enjoy interfacing with the external world a little bit more than introverts. All right, skills. Now that we've talked about problem solving, let's talk about skills. The INTJ is going to be a master of few, and the ENTP is probably going to be a jack of all trades. So the INTJ has a sense of wanting to master something, wanting to be a craftsman at something. And the feedback loop for this is generally purely internal, alluding to functions theory. Their introverted feeling creates idealistic standards of perfection for whatever work they're doing. Their work may even take a moral dimension after a while. So they want to be really good at a few things that matter instead of knowing a little bit about everything. This is the general pattern. Whereas the ENTP is always trying to learn something new. And they're comfortable with being a generalist. They're comfortable with picking up a skill just to fulfill a task. They enjoy learning on the fly as needed. And they also don't need to excel or be an expert at a given task. They're comfortable with just learning enough to get this stuff done. As a result, the INTJ has a much more personal investment in their skill set than the ENTP. The ENTP is comfortable with wearing multiple hats and doing whatever is needed as long as it's serving their need to explore and learn. So, for example, the ENTP may have some design skills and some research skills and some content writing skills. And this is why they make good entrepreneurs, is because they can wear multiple hats as needed. They may even be interested in sales because they can talk to people. So the ENTP is more open to learning skills on the fly. whereas the INTJ really needs to prepare and evaluate skills before facing a problem. And because of the energy cost of specializing, they tend to limit their interests and skills thematically. And then they're usually very self-aware of their abilities, so they have this metacognitive library of what they can and cannot do, what they know and what they don't know. That's specific to the INTJ. And as a result, there's a certain fear of incompetence that haunts them. So they always want to present a competent face in social situations. So their skills are definitely that they're sensitive about, and they really want to be proficient at whatever they do. And that requires locking down and limiting one's fear, depending on their ability and their energy levels. But the ENTP is not really as concerned with what they know, but what they can know. So an ENTP does not necessarily keep track of what they've forgotten. They don't test themselves. They don't go out of their way to compare themselves via some standardized measure to see how they rank. They don't necessarily have to go out of their way to stay updated just in case they need something. They're comfortable with knowing just enough that they can always pick up more skills as needed. And as a result, they may have an easier time with a changing job market because the change is exciting, the dynamic world is stimulating for them. All right, social styles. The INTJ's communication style is going to be very formal and professional. They're going to have a serious demeanor, some sort of impersonal interface that they use with most of their coworkers. They may occasionally drop bits of dark humor and sarcasm here and there, but they don't go out of their way to make jokes. They can sometimes appear aloof, disagreeable, or arrogant when they're prioritizing efficient communication over tact or politeness. And they don't engage a lot with team activities, games, contests, generally things that HR departments do to create a sense of camaraderie. They prefer to work alone. They prefer to separate their work and life quite a bit. Whereas the ENTPs is a lot more lax about professional protocols. They can choose to fit in. They're okay with viewing their workmates as friends. They're generally more social, being extroverts. They can be charismatic if they're well developed, with frequent lighthearted humor and jokes. They appear warm and approachable to others, and they thrive on team activities, games, and contests. They want to break from working on something alone for a long time. And this slide just may apply to all introverts and extroverts to some extent. Another dimension that's potentially being reflected here is the difference between introverted feeling and extroverted feeling. As introverted feeling can generally appear colder. Okay, slide 6, energy source. As the INTJ locks down a vision and they're making successive steps towards a goal, they feel more powerful, and there is a deep satisfaction that comes with fulfilling their visions. If they can control enough variables in the external world such that the way they predict the world unfolds exactly as it does and to their will, there's a deep sense of gratification that comes from that. And this is not only at work, but in their personal lives as well. So they are energized by environments that are not too chaotic and that can be effectively modeled with their intuitions. Whereas the ENTP actually thrives on chaos. They may go out of their way to chase chaos. The ENTP is stimulated by a dynamic environment. If something is too predictable, it becomes boring and not challenging enough. So as a result, they may go out of their way to seek out highly dynamic environments. You may find them leaving safe corporate jobs for startups or to start their own gig. And the more experimental something is, the greater the risk. Like the motto is, the greater the risk, the greater the reward. The INTJs are proud of their ability to avert crises, and they find serenity in all of the things they do to prevent things from going wrong. So you might see them in engineering, for example, working on stress testing a system to see that it can handle a crisis of sorts. And even if they can't completely model how the world, all the ways the world can go wrong for them or the system, they will put safety controls in place that give them a sense of peace. And they're generally good with probabilities, so they can weigh and prioritize danger. This is an area where they complement each other, because the ENTP will think of all the ways that things could be better, or all the possibilities in which a product can evolve. Whereas the INTJ will think about all the ways that things may go wrong, all the things that may prevent a goal from being achieved, and then prioritize in preventing those bad things from happening. INTJs are okay with physical routines, but not so much with cognitive routines, and that's why they love automation. So if there's a repeatable mental process that needs to be done over and over again, then they will find a way to automate it or make it bearable. But they accept it. Even if it's not their favorite thing, they accept it. So in this sense, the INTJ stands between the ISTJ and the ENTP. It's somewhere in the middle. Whereas the ENTP abhors routine cognitive work. If something requires repetitive, detailed manipulation of bits or data or spreadsheet cells, and there isn't a lot of originality happening, there isn't a lot of room for creativity, then the ENTP may just choose not to. And they frequently get in trouble in workplaces because they just don't want to do the boring stuff that everyone else has to do. They don't like the feeling of being controlled and being forced to do things that don't make sense to them. Okay, output. What do they actually produce? The INTJ's product is going to be a roadmap. It's going to be a plan. It's going to be something that's both sound and valid. Does it make sense, and does it work? These are the things that the INTJ cares about. They can pre-optimize solutions across many axes. So if, for example, a company wants to release a product, they can talk to different stakeholders and come up with a solution that satisfies the requirements of the stakeholders, while at the same time ensuring technical integrity. Their ability to adjust values, their ability to dynamically adjust plans or redesign plans or architect around plans and account for all of these concerns, a broad set of concerns, is their superpower at work. Whereas the ENTP has a more local focus on the product. So they value brilliance. So if they come up with something that's original, if they invent a new algorithm or something that can be patented, they want to own that. They think that the only work that really matters is stuff that's original. I've seen ENTPs go out of their way to invent new frameworks instead of reusing the standard one that everyone uses. And this can sometimes get them in trouble. That need to innovate, that need to push boundaries, that makes them do that. The INTJ is a lot more yielding to the consensus of teams or groups or executives, and they don't go out of their way to shake the boat. If they're on a boat that they like, so they're working for a company that they like, they don't go out of their way to destroy preconceived ideas and rebuilding them. Whereas the ENTP wants to have the freedom to question fundamental assumptions about the problem space. And this can sometimes be useful in a group setting, but it can also sometimes disrupt meetings. For example, the INTJ may be forced to solve a problem that doesn't necessarily need solving, but it's part of their job, so they might do it. Whereas the ENTP will stop and question, is this even a problem that I should solve? So this freedom to question things can get in the way of getting things done. They are not comfortable, the ENTP is not very comfortable with constraints. They're able to sandbox their solution into an ideal mental space and optimize for it. And practical everyday constraints that people impose on them, they find unreliable and artificial. And they don't really trust standard processes. They don't trust facts. They don't trust the conclusions of experts. They don't trust authority by default. They feel or they think that they have to individually evaluate each thing, or they should have the freedom to. And as a result, they can have a problem interfacing with other people. Another area of concern here is deadlines. Is sometimes the INTJ is very willing to compromise to meet deadlines, whereas the ENTP kind of sees deadlines as things that could prematurely terminate a beautiful idea that they're creating in their mental sandbox. And then finally, the INTJ gets a lot of enjoyment out of implementing things. So having a rich portfolio, having things to show for their efforts. This can take the form of a product that people use, or even accolades, but something concrete in physical reality that people are using, something that is having an effect on people's lives. Even if it's not what they initially wanted, being part of that is valuable to the INTJ. Whereas the ENTPs doesn't really care about the implementation. So they are comfortable with inventing new ideas, passing them along to someone who can carry off the implementation, then moving on to the next idea. And oftentimes the implementation may not be up to par with their intended idea, but that doesn't really upset them as much as it would an INTJ. And then finally, they're a lot more process oriented, so they have a different philosophy of productivity. An INTJ will want concrete milestones, achievable bits along the way, whereas the ENTP is comfortable with vague starting and finish points. And sometimes they're okay with endless projects. They may be okay with fixing bugs in a system. If every bug is helping the system move in a positive direction, the movement of the larger system, the larger ship, is not as important to them. And they don't necessarily need a roadmap to function. So they can walk into a completely undefined, undifferentiated space and trust that it'll work out. They may start a partnership or a business without even having an idea, or they may change ideas. They may, as a result, they're a lot more optimistic. And even if their project fails, as long as they enjoyed it, as long as they engaged in some sort of creative ideational process with people, it's still not lost for them. So it's less of a loss for the ENTP. So there's a sense that they're maybe a little bit more comfortable with what many consider failure, whereas the INTJ needs a roadmap to move, and they need to be able to measure where they are on that roadmap. There needs to be some kind of final destination. And this can sometimes cause the INTJ frustration, because it may cause the INTJ to ask questions outside their scope and perhaps challenge authority. Because in many situations, especially in SJ environments, I've observed, the future can be very reactive to whatever happens in the external world. And the INTJ wants to be on a ship with a captain that has foresight. And if it's not, then they will project their foresight onto the world. Finally, points of harmony. What INTJs love about ENTPs and vice versa. The INTJ loves the very high rate of idea flow and creativity that the ENTP brings to the table. INTJs, introverted intuitives in general, are not consciously creative. What I mean by that is, in the classical period, they used to think that there were demons, unconscious demons, that gave people ideas, or genius used to be this unconscious demon. So the creativity process for the INTJ and INFJ, introverted intuitives in general, tends to be subconscious. They tend to be in the grip of some kind of inspiration or vision when they're doing things. It's not something that they're consciously controlling. So it can be refreshing for them to see an ENTP that's consciously generating new ideas. They also love that they're generally compatible as project partners. Being both intuitives, they can communicate easily, and they can work with loosely defined terms. They don't need to spell things out. They're comfortable with vague agreements and vague concepts. So of all the types, I would say the ENTP is possibly the most compatible with the INTJ in a business-like endeavor. They appreciate that the ENTP pokes holes. The ENTP is not afraid to challenge ideas, given that INTJs can sometimes be narrow in their vision, or they may have blind spots, the ENTP can point that out. And then just as far as interests go, the ENTP is going to have more of an awareness of everything that's going on in the world, not just in that specific work context. So they just tend to be interesting people with different sorts of skills, whereas INTJs will tend to pick one or two or a few things and be really good at them. So an ENTP may cook, play instruments, and read fiction or write fiction or do all these things on top of being a programmer, whereas an INTJ will probably be a very good programmer or whatever their role is, and even use some of the time that would be allocated to hobbies and stuff towards sharpening the skills they have. And then the ENTP is going to have an encyclopedic index to ideas, and this is that extroverted intuition from a cognitive functions point of view, which is basically a perpetual survey of all the ideas that are out there in the world, regardless of their immediate utility for the person. They can be great conversationalists, even outside of work, and they can bring inspiration from disparate areas because of that. And then finally, there's an intellectual openness to the ENTP that comes from being an intuitive, that the INTJ may appreciate. The things that ENTPs love about INTJs have a get stuff done attitude. So like I mentioned in a previous slide, ENTPs can have a lot of projects started, but none of them finished. And they may sometimes criticize themselves as being too lazy or not disciplined enough to finish things on time. And so they see some of those qualities they may lack in themselves in the INTJ and admire them for that. They appreciate the stability and calmness that the INTJ brings to the table. The INTJ tends to be very emotionally stable and not very reactive. That's always a good thing for the ENTP, who may say some things that are politically incorrect or even may seem innocuous to the ENTP but could offend people. And then INTJs have a great capacity for managing complexity. So they have that impressionistic memory that helps them factor in things that the rest of the team members may have forgotten. And so the ENTP, who is like most NTPs, is somewhat mistrustful of physical reality, may delegate that task of navigating the chaotic, unreliable world to the INTJ because they're able to account for risk and think probabilistically. They appreciate the slow and deep thinking, and INTJs are capable of focusing on an idea for a very long time and thinking very slowly about it. And it can complement the breadth of the ENTPs. To use a programming analogy, it's the ENTP prefers breadth first search, and then the INTJ prefers depth first search. And then they like the virtue of intellectual integrity, which is basically not bullshitting, not lying, not pretending to know things that they don't know. All right, points of discordance. The INTJ may criticize the ENTP for wasted potential and abandoned projects. Boredom is a serious problem for ENTPs, and so the INTJ can sometimes find some of the ideas that ENTP has discarded out of boredom to be compatible with the present world, and they may think that it can be executed upon, and they may see this as let's just say the graveyard, the project or the ideational graveyard of the ENTP as a waste. And then they can see that the ENTP kind of disregards the middle steps. They focus only on the beginning and ending, and even vaguely sometimes. And this is that weak, from a functions point of view, it's that weak introverted sensing function that's supposed to fill in the path between the process, how to get from A to B. They can have a lack of follow through, and all EPs have this to some extent, and it's just low conscientiousness. If the ENTP scores low on low conscientiousness, which it's correlated with, they may criticize them for being irresponsible or flaky to a much lesser degree than other EP types, but it still can be an issue for the INTJ, who has committed to a vision and wants to see it through. The ENTP, for example, may jump on a more exciting idea or quickly adapt to changing circumstances, which the INTJ may be oblivious to. And as a result, they may consider that flaky behavior. Tricky thing is that the INTJ, even though they're not overtly emotional, they still have core values that guide them. And one of these core values tends to be honesty. And the ENTP may sometimes bend the truth to get through difficult social situations. And if the INTJ, for example, has over-indexed on the value of honesty and they witness the ENTP lying, they may take that to be a grave moral offense because it's violated their core moral principle. And this is going to be something the ENTP is not going to understand. So this is actually an issue in a lot of INTJ ENTP relationships that I've seen, is that the INTJ will have a set of core values that are very important to him or her, but are not obvious to the ENTP, who navigates moral situations more contextually. And if it's not communicated, then the ENTP will feel silently judged, whereas the INTJ will have formed a character model of the ENTP that may even destroy their relationship. And then finally, dilettantism, shiny object syndrome. This is essentially just you're not holding on to an idea long enough for it to become a fruit. You're abandoning your babies too early before they get to grow up. They're not focused enough. Okay, what does the ENTP hate about the INTJ? The ENTP is going to be a lot more optimistic, generally a lot more optimistic about outcomes than the INTJ. As a result, the intense planning might seem excessive to them, and they may even judge them for being perfectionistic. So this can take both the logical route where they need to spell everything out, or even a moral route if their values dictate that they can't cut some corners. The ENTP may get frustrated by what they see as arbitrary, self-limiting behaviors. And then the ENTP is going to also see potential in the INTJ that's wasted because they have tunnel vision, a narrow skill base, or they want to over-prepare for things. The ENTP is going to be more in touch with the immediate distribution of human behaviors and human skills around them. And in comparison to that bell-shaped curve, the INTJ may already be at the top, but the INTJ can be totally oblivious to that. And that may frustrate the ENTP, who may see that the INTJ is just overly optimizing for things that don't really matter. Okay. Exaggerated risk perception. The risk phobia of the INJs in general, the IJs, is a well-known thing. And even though they are good at evaluating the probability of danger, they may misjudge the impact of those risks. The INTJ may be good at predicting that there's a X percentage chance of things going wrong, but they may see that in a very binary way where if things go wrong, then it's hell and the world has ended. The ENTP is generally more comfortable with that kind of stuff. And then this goes with the tact point, which is the INTJ can have tact, but it's not a priority for them. And what they consider to be efficient communication or taking an efficient route to the obvious truth, which reinforces their sense of integrity, may be seen by the ENTP as unnecessarily blunt. If you just lie a little bit, if you just bend the truth a little bit, if you sugarcoat things a little bit, then things will get done faster. And what the INTJ considers dilettantism, the ENTP may judge the INTP for actually specializing too early. All right, final slide. Tips for the INTJ. Tolerate what seems like impractical ideation. All NTPs like their ideas. So INTJs, NTJs in general, tend to have what's called an ego dystonic or a detached way of looking at their thinking. They generally don't care for where an idea originated, as long as it works. So while being seen as incompetent is not something they want, they're okay to be wrong if their idea is demonstrably wrong. And they actually prefer to get feedback on wrong ideas. So ideas for INTJs are something to be validated, something to be vetted against reality, and not something personal. What often happens is an ENTP comes up with an idea or a hypothesis, and they pitch it to the INTJ, and the INTJ may immediately dismiss it. And if it was another INTJ doing the same thing, their thought is that, oh, I'm doing them a favor, because they would also like their ideas to be sharpened to some extent. However, the ENTP does not like that. NTPs in general do not like for ideas to be shot down, because the validity of ideas rests in the ideas themselves for the ENTPs. It's intrinsic to the ideas. It's not about the world. It's not about facts. It's not about what science says. It's about the consistency of the idea. So when the INTJ does their instinctual sort of reality testing on these ideas, it may seem like they're shooting them down. If the ENTP is coming up with ideas, just listen to them and withhold that instinct to shoot things down or criticize things or even correct things, unless they ask for it, unless they ask for feedback. Okay, and then have some lighthearted, harmless fun. And this is another issue between the INTJ and the ENTP, is the INTJ overestimates the seriousness of the ENTP and the opposite. So the ENTP thinks the INTJ is not as serious as they are. INTJs are generally very serious people, and ENTPs are generally very not serious people. And as a result, some of the poking, some of the social gestures that may be considered harmless to the ENTP can really irritate the INTJ. A lot of the things that the ENTP does to get an extroverted feeling reaction can seem to the INTJ as pointless. So it's important for them to get on the same wavelength as the ENTP if they want to work with them, to understand they don't come from a polarized sort of moral internal world most of the time. All right. And then update your rigid perceptions with fresh data and new possibilities. What this means is introverted intuition wants to be right. And it usually is. But in most cases, it's once an introverted intuition vision is formed, it no longer accepts new data. So it can expire. And the ENTP or other extroverted perceivers like ESTP or ESFP and ENFP are good at keeping up to date with all the changes that are going on. And so you can, if you actually listen to their new ideas, if you let go of your introverted intuition ideas for a minute, if you can suspend your disbelief in their ideas, you may learn that the world has changed and your introverted intuition vision may need updates. And then time urgency difference is another thing, and this kind of goes back to that seriousness thing, is the internal world of the ENTP is timeless. It exists in a timeless realm where ideas are evolving independent of everyday constraints. If you time box a discussion, which is limiting a discussion to a meeting, and say we have to come to a decision, then if you force them to make decisions, if you're trying to get things moving, you're going to get some resistance from the ENTP. I can't think of an easy solution for this, because this is important to do in the workplace. So there's no easy solution to this, but expect some pushback if you're trying to get things done on time. And then the last one is going to be almost impossible to do, unless both types are very well developed and very self-aware. But INTJs expect people to understand their intentions. So what the ENTP sees as playful nitpicking or endless sort of recursive hair-splitting of ideas can really frustrate the INTJ, because they think that the people they know or the people they trust should infer their intentions, like what they mean behind what they say. This difference applies to all introverted thinking types, this difference with INTJs. And it has to do with introverted feeling focusing on the general intention and not the logical structure of what's communicated. So if an INTJ somehow is able to communicate their values, and that requires a lot of trust, and really explain to the ENTP where they're coming from, the ENTP can then build up on that. But if they don't do this, then from the external point of view, the INTJ is just going to have all of these arbitrary sensitive teeth and arbitrary concerns and arbitrary hyper focuses on some areas. And so for the ENTP, the INTJ may come across as an irritable robot, to put it unkindly. Okay, for the ENTP, just try to mold your ideas to fit the conventional, what you probably judge as everyday ways of looking at the world. This is just molding to your immediate conventions, not necessarily the best way to evaluate your ideas. For example, you may disagree with a specific way of doing business, but that's what the team does. So it's just, I guess, maybe requires sacrificing your inner truth to adapt to that. And that'll make it much easier to have discussions. That'll make it much easier for your ideas to gain acceptance into the INTJ's world. And then whenever you engage in ideational voyages or brainstorming sessions and what ifs, try to tie it back to the relevant context. Try to make sure it doesn't devolve into an unresolvable philosophical discussion. Try not to engage in debates that may be interesting in a non-work context, but are not really helpful in the immediate situation. So if you're able to do this, then more of your ideas may make it across the INTJ. And then the quirks and the dark humor insights. So if an INTJ befriends you, they may sort of open up and expose their quirky side and some of their dark jokes. And all introverted feelers, I think, can be very dark, but the INTJ especially can say some very dark things, but in a sort of playful way. And you have to tolerate this, let's just say, deviation from the norm to really get their jokes. You have to suspend your social judgments of what's normal and what's weird. And if you do that, you may get yourself a friend. So there's that. All right. And then finally, just know that there's more boiling under the surface, that when an INTJ says something, they've generally thought about it more for a long time. And there's a lot of things about their vision that they can't articulate or can't debate. And I think a little bit of trust is just needed, because debates will not resolve a lot of these things. And I think what may happen is, with experience, the ENTP will trust more of the INTJ's predictions and visions if they get along. There's no conscious way of resolving the obscurity of the inner workings of the INTJ.